like Starry Night by Vincent Van Gogh is a great example, to bring up when you're looking at things like the night sky and stars and things like that. There's always art to show that can relate to the different subject matters that you're showing. Whether it's a Dr. Seuss type art or it's art from art history like Van Gogh, and different things like that. There is there's a whole source of examples that you can be drawn from, no pun intended. So, so I have something here that I want to engage in. What do you do if the student's artistic exploration doesn't match the standards of the lesson you're teaching? So, trying to think of an example for that. So, if there's always a way to bring it in somehow. If the standards of the lesson, for example, are about shape relationships. Let's say you're doing geometry, and they're doing a bunch of dots instead of different shapes. And this is just kind of off the top, so bear with me. Explaining this one here. There could be a way to view those dots, for example, more as some of the elements of the geometry. Or another example might be that's a standard teaching lesson. I would say, in some cases, let them keep going with it while continuing to encourage the integration of the lesson. If we just say to them, well, that doesn't work with what we're working on. Some of this is, if I had a more specific example, I might be able to, to a little more specific. But some of this is you as teachers finding ways to allow things to work within that lesson, even if it's not specifically what you had in mind. Like, for example, when that girl we were working on color mixing, right? And we were doing this automatic color mixing. She didn't want to do the painting and didn't want to mix the colors. So I said, so she started doing the 6 7s in a bunch of different colors. So her exploration didn't match the standards of the lesson, but I worked it so that it could by giving her the colored pencils, by encouraging her to try some of the different colors. She didn't realize it, and I don't know if she realized it after the fact, but she created a lot of the different types of color mixing that we did through having the reds next to the greens, right? One of the things that happens in art, and this can be seen in, for example, pointillism, like George Seurat, Sunday Afternoon on the Island of the Grand Shot, what we call optical color mixing. So that means basically if you have a red next to a green and you back up, and you look at that color, that optically those colors are going to blend, together. And the farther away you back up, for example, the grayer those colors will be. So there are ways to mix colors without actually mixing colors. There are ways to, to engage with a particular kind of lesson or situation without seeming like you are engaged. When I was teaching, and I think I gave the example earlier about the teacher who was, wanted to really stick with some strict guidelines, and I loosened it up. Those kids did all of the guidelines. They did it without working within necessarily the structure that I set, but they still got the point. And I think that can be kind of an important thing. If you're doing something with, let's say, I'm going to use planets as another example. I'm drawing, a ton of planets, but this, person is just doing a bunch of different circles, right? Rather than just making them look like they're in a solar system, but they just did a whole bunch of chains of circles together. planets, and they, 90 circles for the planets, but they just want to keep going circle, 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 circle. Bringing that into more, into the different elements of what the planets do. Well, these planets are revolving around the sun, and you can see each of these circles represents a different phase of movement. Now you're re-engaging the assignment. Now it's not just them doing a bunch of strictly circles. Now you've brought them back into the assignment. So some of it is using your own imagination and creativity to pull it back in, and to show them that, oh, well, see, this is still, working with the plan. Maybe they start doing scribbles. Oh, those could be commas that are going on the face. Right? There are ways to be in that sense. So part of it, I think, as teachers is to be a little bit looser and have imagination yourself on how things can go. How will this work? Because if the child is working on something and they're engaging in that creative process, but they're, going without, going outside of the bounds of what seemed to be out of the bounds of the lesson, you can find ways to show them how they're doing something that's still involved in the lesson. And what that can do is pull them back in and then get them to see that they weren't just rebelling against the lesson or doing their own thing. They were still actually engaging with it, and that can help them to get a little bit more focused and to come back in. So I hope without having a specific example there, I kind of explain that. Focus on big ideas and their exploration will match. And so that's kind of a thing too. If your lessons sometimes have to be very specific, but within the framework of a lesson, there's a million different ways to engage with creativity. If you're studying a point in history, okay, let's say you're doing the Revolutionary War or something like that, you had like the redcoats, for example. Maybe they're using a lot of red. Maybe they do an abstract thing with a bunch of red here, small amount of red, rather than doing a specific long amount of red. More of an abstraction showing that, wow, there was a lot, there was way more of the red, but you have a lot more, like blue was able